Good morning, Watershed, and happy Easter. My name is Shawn, and it's such a joy to be with you today. If you're new here or online, let me welcome you to this space. Watershed is a vagabond community of truth seekers. We come from churched and unchurched paths, and all are welcome here. We're in a series that is exploring our connection to the land and our responsibility to it. Wild Recollection is a series to remind us of our roots, of where we come from. Biblically speaking, the wilderness is a landscape that is profoundly sacred and cataclysmic. In the Bible, we know wilderness, or words that translate to wilderness, appear roughly 300 times. Moses and the people of Israel searched for promised land and were sustained by water and manna in the desert wilderness. People encountered God in the sacred wilderness. Elijah, Hagar, Moses and his burning bush, Mount Sinai as the dwelling place of God. All of this makes sense, but when we consider Genesis and the ordination of the world, it's clear God dwells in nature. It's clear that natural landscapes are considered holy places. The wilderness is a site of change, a site of encountering the divine. The New Testament, too, points to the important role of nature. For the wilderness is there in most of the critical moments in the short life of Jesus. He was baptized with river water. He seeks solace and refuge away from the crowds by taking a boat offshore. Mark tells us Jesus went out to a lonely place, and there he prayed. And later, in the twilight days of his life, Jesus is in a garden where an intense spiritual battle takes place. These passages illustrate that Jesus sought refuge in nature. These sacred outdoor places were sites of self-discovery and solitude, sites where the divine was intensely present. It seems to me that Scripture clearly points to the holy nature of, nature. There is a deep connection to be found in the wild places, the ones created by God and left wholly untouched. Beyond the simple geography of the wilderness, there is also a theology gained by entering into these wild places. I want to visit the story of Elijah for just a moment. Elijah, in the book of Kings, is a Hebrew prophet who flees in fear of his life. He's driven out into the wilderness, and in a cave, he encounters God. There, Elijah went into a cave and stayed all night. Then the Lord spoke his word to him, "Elijah, why are you here?" He answered, "Lord God all-powerful, I have always served you as well as I could. But the people of Israel have broken their agreement with you, destroyed your altars, and killed your prophets with swords. I am the only prophet left, and now they're trying to kill me too." The Lord said to Elijah, "Go, stand in front of me on the mountain, and I will pass by you." Then a very strong wind blew until it caused the mountains to fall apart and large rocks to break in front of the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. After the fire, there was a quiet, gentle sound. When Elijah heard it, he covered his face with his coat and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Elijah, in this moment, is depressed, he's fearful, he's discouraged, he's hit a low moment, and it is in that moment God reveals himself, not in a grand, dramatic way, although he orchestrates those to occur, but in a quiet, gentle sound. God reveals himself in a moment of peace. And I don't know about you, but that's when I have felt an undeniable presence of God too. In the panoramic vista at the top of a mountain lake, listening to the ocean tide come in rhythmically, walking through a dense rainforest under the canopy of a literal jungle, observing an intricate and ordered pattern in a spider's web, seeing a bird delight in the rain. These are quiet moments so full of God's presence, it seems the only appropriate response is odd silence. For it is here that we can observe the world as God created it. Here we can find cosmic patterns repeated. The veins of a leaf that look like the lifelines of a human palm is one such example. If we pay attention, really pay attention, the miraculous architecture of the natural world astonishes. And for me, it is evidence that we are all intricately and divinely connected to the world of creation. We are part of creation itself, not separate or above it. Tell me God doesn't abide in nature. And if we are indeed connected intrinsically with the natural world, then I wonder if there aren't lessons there for us to glean from. Lessons that are likely lost to us now because we have severed our connection to the land. We live in discord with nature. Somewhere, I'm guessing the Industrial Revolution, we went from being co-citizens with the land to conquerors of the land. We have no land ethic anymore. Ethics tells us how to be in community with each other. We have rules, codes of conduct, laws that govern how we ought to live with one another. Last week, Blair shared with us the rules of Shemitah in Leviticus that governed how ancient Jews were supposed to treat the land. Aldo Leopold, who is considered the father of the American conservation movement, suggests that a land ethic simply extends the notion of community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or what Leopold calls simply the land. Modern society has created a culture where I think by and large we are divorced from the land. It wasn't always like this. And in some places of the world, there is still an understanding and respect for the codependence we have with nature. I think of my father in Costa Rica. He's made friends with the butcher in town. When he buys meat, it's from the butcher's shop, and the butcher can guarantee him that the pound of meat he just bought was sourced from a single cow locally. The butcher probably knows the cattle rancher. Next, my dad will go to the various other stalls in the farmer's market, where he will buy vegetables and fruit directly from the farmers who grew those plants from seed and harvested them with their own hands. I remember a visit to Guatemala, where I have spent some time with a group of Quiche women, an indigenous Mayan tribe. They formed a co-op where they sell their colorful weavings to help support their community. They were having a meeting and had graciously allowed me to sit in. They met in a cornfield, in the middle of a cornfield. It's an image I will never forget. Colorful huipiles and cortes. Huipiles and cortes are the names of the traditional woven skirts and shirts that they wear that make up their traje, their customary clothing. Anyway, these colorful huipiles and cortes blended into a sea of corn stalks. A few women had notebooks, but that was as far as office technology went. There were no desks, no easy places to sit, no need for computers or phones. I was so moved by this. I still am. My father and my friends from Guatemala benefit from living in a community that still has a lifeblood tied to its agrarian roots. There is a communal respect for the land, a deep understanding of the codependence that sustains life all around. Again, it makes me revisit the short arc of Jesus' time amongst humans, where we clearly see a man who sought refuge in the outdoors. Of course, the Jesus of Scripture was a man living and communing in an agrarian society, so in many ways, this isn't surprising. Agrarian life necessitated a deep and abiding connection to the land. Farmers and fishermen in Galilee and surrounding areas knew the earth differently than we do. But our origin story as humans started in a garden, an oasis abundant in natural life, in flora and fauna. At our inception, we were designed to commune in nature, and yet we don't. In the name of progress and evolution, we've distanced ourselves from our natural surroundings. We spend the bulk of our time indoors. We miss so much. Nature has profound lessons and messages for us, but we miss it because we don't abide in the wild, natural spaces. We don't sit and stop long enough in nature to receive its gifts. What a tragedy. It's Easter, and I think one of the most salient lessons nature provides us is about resurrection. The natural world abides by a cyclical marking of time. Things die, and in the process, they nurture the ground they return to, their matter counting for something, their molecules becoming life again. Then sprouts grow, push through the earth and breathe new life. Death isn't the end. Nature might argue it's the beginning again. Death isn't the end. We are made new. Death isn't the end. It isn't the end in nature, and it wasn't the end in the story of Jesus. So perhaps it's not the end for us either. I don't think it's wild conjecture to say that Jesus could have easily skipped the whole death scene of his story. After all, his mother ascended into heaven without ever dying. Jesus could have, as one of his crossmates said, asked his father to simply remove him from the painful situation he was in. But he didn't. And I want to underscore this. I don't think that this was about glorifying pain or sacrifice. I don't think that the death of Jesus is about extolling virtues of pain. Henry Nouwen offers this in regards of the suffering of Jesus. Jesus does not glorify them or call them beautiful, good, or something to be desired. Jesus does not call for heroism or suicidal self-sacrifice. No, Jesus invites us to look at the reality of our existence and reveals this harsh reality as the way to new life. The core message of Jesus is that real joy and real peace can never be reached while bypassing suffering and death, but only by going right through them. Jesus could have avoided the final act of his human life, but he chose instead to see it through, to live the whole cycle of a human life. His death and burial are just as important as his birth. The public death of Jesus is a lesson for all of mankind. Richard Rohr offers wisdom on this better than I can. He says, Jesus' incarnate life, his passing over into death, and his resurrection into the ongoing Christ life is the archetypal model for the entire pattern of creation. He is the microcosm for the whole cosmos, or the map of the whole journey, in case you need or want one. Jesus' death follows the pattern set out since the beginning of time. Death is a transformative process. I think the resurrection of Jesus is an important tenet of Christian belief. Jesus' physical existence is critical. The incarnation of Jesus Christ is vital, making his human death a key part of the story. His bodily, physical resurrection affirms our connection to creation. Jesus' incarnate experience of death and his subsequent transformation, his resurrection into heaven, show us that we belong to something greater, that we are a part of creation. And I get it, believing the resurrection story of Christ might at first pass suggest that we have to suspend reality. It might be easier for us to believe in the spiritual dimensions of this story. Perhaps the authors of the Gospels spoke in metaphor. Except that they didn't, not really. The Gospels are a narrative telling of the life of Jesus. They are an eyewitness account, firsthand observations about a man named Jesus. And yes, there are differences among them. That's to be expected when you have different lenses writing to different audiences. In all of them, though, the central messaging is pretty straightforward. Here's the story about a man named Jesus. For me, the resurrection being a story about a body's transformation and not just a spiritual transformation seems to be at the center of the story. And again, I'm going to lean on Richard Rohr. Personally, he says, I do believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus because it affirms what the whole physical and biological universe is also saying and grounds it in one personality. Resurrection must also be fully practical and material. If matter is inhabited by God, then matter is somehow eternal. And when the Creed says we believe in the resurrection of the body, it means our bodies too, not just Jesus' body. As in him, so also in us. As in all of us, so also in him. And he says, so I'm quite conservative and orthodox by most standards on this important issue, although I realize it seems to be a very different kind of embodiment post-resurrection as suggested by the gospel accounts. I think this makes the resurrection of Jesus not special because he is the Son of God, but special because it tethers us, mere mortals, to something sacred and divine. If matter is eternal, then so too are we. This is the promise of resurrection, the lesson beyond the grave. I cannot lie. This offers me incredible hope. In a year where I saw every matriarchal figure in my life die, both of my grandmothers, my godmother, my mom, in one calendar year, this promise of resurrection is something I cling to. I don't know what heaven is like. I don't think the scriptures talk about it much. I've been digging. There's not much there. It seems the emphasis is more about how to bring heaven to earth. I'm not so much concerned anymore about what the afterlife looks like as I am in the idea that there is a place we go to, that death is not permanent. The resurrection story helps me release my grip on fear that I will see my mother again. It helps me release my grip on fear that somehow she just ceased to exist. In a newsletter entitled Hope in the Time of Crisis, Franciscan sister and scientist Ilia Delio wrote, Christianity can help us realize that death and resurrection are part of the evolutionary path towards wholeness. Letting go of isolated existence for the sake of deeper union. Something dies, but something new is born, which is why the chaos of our times is, in a strange way, a sign of hope. Something new is being born within. Out of chaos, a star is born. Breakdown can be breakthrough if we recognize a new pattern of life struggling to emerge. My mother has been transformed, as has anyone else who has experienced the liberation of death. She is made better, more whole than she ever was earthside. My world has been thrown off its axis, and it feels like chaos sometimes, moving through this life without her physical presence in it. But slowly I am coming to see gifts of grief, things I'm tucking away for now. My own life is emerging in new patterns in this post-pandemic existence. I am being made new from both physical and spiritual deaths. It's not hard to make death out to be the worst possible case scenario that it can be. Death is hard, devastatingly painful. I say that with conviction. In our flawed humanness, we cannot see past the finality of death. Mary Magdalene wept at the grave of Jesus, and his friends and disciples scattered in fear, losing all hope. But we know what happened next. We get to see the whole story. Easter invites us to, as Brian McLaren says, discover that God is already here, unrecognized. I spent 4 Thursdays in March processing my mother's death in a group grief workshop at an Episcopal church here in Charlotte. The co-leaders, they gave us these prompts to work through, and I have a binder of readings and exercises, just stuff. And I kept the workbook in my car, and Ethan, one of my sons, saw it and opened it. And I've been trying really hard not to shield the boys from my grief, to model that emotions are important and that it's okay to not always be okay. This is not what I meant, though, so I'm like, do I let him leaf through it? And I'm driving, so I have to make a lot of micro decisions at once. And I was racing, like, what did I write? I don't remember. So he's reading some of the prompts out loud to me and reading some of my responses. And it was an okay moment. And then he just closes the binder, and very calmly he says, this is what I think happens when you die. I think we come back, but we look different, so no one recognizes you. We have the same personality and skills we had before, but we're better at them. And God gives us new skills too. Abuela, which is the Spanish word for grandmother, so my mom. Abuela is here with us. We just can't see her, Mom. And he delivered this so flawlessly, like no sweat. And here's what struck me in that moment. First, I think this is the first time I've ever heard one of my sons articulate a worldview that is uniquely born of their own ponderings. We have books about religious difference, and I definitely think he's heard of the Hindu concept of reincarnation, but so much of what he said was so original to his own sort of imagination. And secondly, the second thing that struck me is this is the very thing Rohr and other theologians have written about regarding the nature of death. My son, my 9-year-old son, can better accept that truth than I can. My 9-year-old son understands the message of Easter or the joy of resurrection better than I do. The world is still a mess. The ache of missing my mother and all of the other matriarchs in my family has not diminished. Easter doesn't expel pain and suffering, but Easter is a proclamation that joy is part of death because death is not the end. Today, my prayer is one of thanksgiving. It is one of deep gratitude for the creator of this world, for the reminders of God's infinite creativity, for the softness of the earth beneath my feet, for the bird song that carries joy, for the creek in my backyard that rises and falls but never stops, for the movement of wind that demonstrates God's visibility and invisibility at once, for the quiet, gentle sound Elijah heard at the face of a mountain. I imagine it was the same gentle, quiet sound that deafened the empty cave that couldn't contain Jesus' body. Today, my prayer is one of gratitude for Easter's promise that death is not the end of the story for any of us. May we go out in peace today and drink in the joy of the good news of this day, Watershed. For the darkest of nights yielded the lightest, holiest of hopes. Happy Easter.